And we're back with Martin Melucci and Chuck Granata. We're talking about A Voice on Air, the Frank Sinatra collection of radio performances from the 30s to the 50s. And the fact that these performances still exist in any kind of form, because at the time that they were done, it was ephemera. It was thought just going over the air, but some of them were actually recorded, and some of those recordings actually survived. So I know that you guys spent a lot of time researching, gathering up source material from all kinds of places. So I'd love to hear how this project came together and what it took to produce
This is
it.
John Granata's 20-plus year dream project. And he began collecting material from then on, and possibly even before.
Yeah, I think I started collecting radio material probably around 1990. And I'll show you, Stephen. We have, I
These are
pulled
priceless.
out one of the actual discs. This is one of the Columbia recordings from 1943. It's Frank singing Old Man River, one of the earliest performances of Frank singing Old Man River. And
we didn't even use this one on the set.
As you can see, I can get pretty close. I mean, it's a CBS Radio Columbia Recording Service disc. It's got two sides. So, and it's basically an aluminum disc that's coated with lacquer.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that there's grooves as on a normal record here. The difference is that the lacquer coating that they put on these discs is very fragile, meaning that if it's damaged in some way, it can start to peel off of the base. If it's stored improperly and it begins to bubble because of the humidity or the temperature, once you get a bubble, it's like getting a bubble in a tire. Basically, you can't pop it, you can't play it, and once that bubble actually does break, now the disc starts to peel. So
sometimes it gets to a point where it's still playable, but it's audible. Like we have Coming In on a Wing and a Prayer, and that disc was coming in on a wing and a prayer when it was played back, and that's no joke. The restoration that had to be done to make it sound the way it does, I mean, there was really like night and day, pardon the pun.
Yeah, when you find these elements, normally, ideally, they're in perfect shape. As Old Man River appears to be, if you look at the disc, it's mint. When you play it, you can hear some anomalies, some snap, crackle, pop, ticks, thumps. Sometimes there's, noise from the line if it was transmitted over a phone line in the 40s, which they often did from studio to studio and coast to coast. You'll hear the buzz in the line, the hum in the line. So, even though the disc may be in perfect shape, sometimes there are audio anomalies. And essentially, we're lucky that these survived because first of the lacquer coating issue, and the second part is that in the war years, particularly in 1943 and 1944, the government was rationing metal. So the manufacturers who made these recording discs, the transcription discs, had to resort to a different base to make the disc, the physical disc, and they turned to glass. And there were different grades of glass. There was thicker glass, there was thinner glass, and that presents a whole different problem because for the recordings that are on glass, and same process, they just coated the glass base, the substrate, with lacquer, nitrocellulose lacquer. The problem is, in many cases, because of mishandling and improper storage, those discs have started to crack either all the way through, where they're broken all the way through, or sometimes they have spider cracks, stress fractures. So, once the glass fractures, then the lacquer can start to fracture and spider crack, and it just becomes a myriad of problems that you have to deal with. So we are fortunate that many of these discs survived, and we were able to take them into the studio, and because of our skill and the skill of our incredible transfer engineers and our mastering engineer, Andreas Meyer, we've been able to clean them up and make them sound pretty listenable.
And we've tried to do it as non-intrusively as possible. We've really tried to make sure any processing and restoration work was done where you really don't hear the restoration. There's a couple of tracks that maybe we had to get from an outside source that they were what they were in that regard. But anything we really restored, we restored.
Yeah, we tried
invisibly as much as possible. I mean, Andreas did so many thousands of manual fixes as far as fixing noises and whatnot,
right?
That he deserves an award just for that, and that's no exaggeration.
Yeah, we were fortunate. I chose to work with Andreas because I knew that he would invest a tremendous amount of time and care into this project, and he did a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
You know, there are various phases that you have to go through when you deal with a project like this. So locating and preserving the discs is one. The transfer process is really critical.
We even tried bringing in different equipment and whatnot. We brought in an old Macintosh 2 preamp that this great restoring engineer, technical engineer Dave Dintenfass restored for this. That helped immeasurably. Most of our transfers that were done from our own discs were done through that. And it gave more of a proper sound to it. And it also had a lot of flexibility in the way the discs were played back. When records are cut, they cut out the bass and they jack up the top end. So on playback, there's a noise reduction on bringing the highs down where it's flat, but where it's a wash, but it cuts the disc noise. And because you can't fit all that bass on a disc, you have to cut it first and then boost it back up. But what happened was, by all the different variables that you could dial in on this preamp, there were some discs that, I mentioned this online somewhere, like Shine. Chuck has this disc that we used that had this transfer done, you think in the late 50s?
Yeah, probably late 50s, early 60s.
And it's longer than anyone outside of someone that maybe had the original disc has ever heard before. And when we first put it up, it sounded a lot better than people have heard it, but it sounded very heavy. And I found that by dialing in that playback EQ just so on the bass, it brought most of the sound there. Then with very fine EQ afterwards, it finally put it in balance. And there were a few other tracks that needed that too.
Yeah, it brought it into line. You know, basically, each of the networks that cut the original transcription discs used a different EQ curve. So having the Macintosh preamp in the chain during the transfer process really allowed us to zero in on the individual EQ curves that were necessary for each disc and each network disc. So, you know, CBS, even within the CBS discs, the ones cut in different years had different playback curves. And in some cases, you know, those curves might have even been boosted and altered a little bit. And we were able to now go in, and with the flexibility in this preamp, we were able to recreate the original curves and then really zone in and refine it to get the best transfer overall.
Yeah.
You know, the one with the best EQ, so that we had good clean bass and nice clean high end, and enough that when we went to the final mastering phase, we could tweak it with some EQ.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the CBS discs was most of them were pretty much in the range where you had to EQ the bass.
Yes.
But there were just a few that stood out. It's like, this is so different than the others. They were so heavy sounding.
Yeah.
My Heart Stood Still was one of them.
Yeah, well, we are. Andreas and I think that the performance of My Heart Stood Still that we included on the set, which we took from a disc, cut in 1943. It may have been a dub.
I'm not sure. It just was odd. It was just so heavy sounding without bringing that turnover down to, I think I had it around 320 or something. It was crazy.
Yeah, we were able to really zone in. But, you know, just because of the process of disc recording and disc-to-disc recording, and, you know, having some of these performances were recorded in New York City, where the show was actually originating from, but Sinatra may have been in Hollywood, so they opened up what they used to call a line, which was basically a Class A phone line, so that he could sing from L.A. So, it's interesting because you can actually hear the click and the turnover when they go to Hollywood.
I heard you cried last night.
Yeah, the fidelity goes down. So that's the reason why one of the songs on disc 1, I Heard You Cried Last Night, was not up to the sonic quality that I had originally set for all of the songs on this box set, but because of its rarity and the fact that Sinatra only sang it once, I felt we needed to include it. It's got a little bit of a lesser audio quality, sonic quality, because that was one of those cases where Frank was in Hollywood, but the disc was being cut in New York.
When we put that disc up, I remember the voice came on from the announcer, and it sounded great. It was so good, another nice sounding one. And all of a sudden, the strings come in. And
they have this stridency to them, and there's this. It's a more distant, unfocused sound. But we were able to compensate and make it listenable. So we have preserved a document that otherwise could have been lost, to time.
Well, that's my next question. Would this restoration have been possible 10 or 15 or even, so many years ago? Is the equipment now sophisticated enough to do that so that you can create a set of these from disparate sources and disparate...
it was able to be done better now.
Now, but it's still not, perfect, right?
Well,
it's as good as the source material will allow, let's face it.
You have to remember right now...
Let's put it that way.
For now, until they develop and perfect a laser beam tracing method where they can use a laser beam to actually trace those grooves.
Including something that has bumps in it, because right now there's laser turntables, but they won't play those discs.
Right. But that technology could afford us in the future to improve the transfer, maybe, of these damaged discs and these discs that are 70 and 80 years old. But keeping in mind that this is still a physical process where you have to have a stylus in a groove, and that groove is cut in a certain way. So, of course, we don't have the original stylus that cut that groove, which would be the best thing.
Well, that exact size, yeah.
But not even just that exact size. Yeah. But it's like if I had the original cutting head or turntable and stylus that some of these things were made on, of course, it's best to play a disc back with exactly what created it. But in that absence, we have a plethora of styli where we can test out different diameters and sizes of the stylus and match it to the groove. And when I say match it, it's not just saying, okay, this disc should be a 1.9 or 2.2 stylus, because that's the cutting. What's more important is the fact that we're not sure in the last 70 years how someone may have played this disc.
Yeah,
and there may have been
played with a knitting needle, and
there may have been damage to the groove, and we now have to test and see if a different styli than the groove was cut with, that kind of styli, will ride the groove differently. Will it ride the sides and eliminate the sound, the noise on the bottom, or vice versa? It's all part of the process. And just the way it
influences the tone and whatnot too.
Yeah, it's all part of the process. I mean, there's a big difference sometimes if you play a disc with a 1.9
truncated
elliptical, and then you're saying, okay, it sounds a little thin, and I hear some noise, and you go to a 2.0 or a 2.1, and all of a sudden, it's like you opened up the box, and this great sound just popped out. So, it's all groove technology, and it's all physical.
And what would really improve in, say, 10, 15 years ago, like you mentioned, is a lot of the restoration tools, electronic-wise, digitally wise. Years ago, you could not necessarily do it as well as we were able to do now, as transparently as we've done now. There's people did attempts years ago with trying to fix rehearsal recordings that didn't even need that sort of fixing to begin with. And you just hear all this electronic tinge on everything.
Well, there's a tendency to over-process.
Yeah.
I think.
We just tried to hit the sweet spot.
My analogy is when you have a great sounding mono master tape, a session tape, let's say that was recorded at Capitol in 1955, you don't have to do anything to it. All you need to do
maybe
is
some minor EQ and that's it, and the right playback.
You need to make sure that your playback EQ is adjusted properly, and your azimuth on your heads are aligned, and you just go with it. But the tendency, because there are a lot of younger engineers with this incredible arsenal of processing equipment at their disposal, at their fingertips.
They want to use it.
Yeah, they want to use it, but they don't understand what mono analog tape recording was, and they have to fuss with it. And then there are engineers that split the signal and engineers that widen the signal. My philosophy is you remain true to the integrity of the original recording. So that means if it doesn't need anything, you don't do anything. And that's really what guided the creation of the masters for this project, was to get the best sounding transfers as we could, and then only do what was absolutely necessary to restore them. And the restoration process is basically just removing the extraneous pops and ticks and anomalies that are inherent in the process of disc recording without affecting the music. And it's very easy for people to over-process in that area. And they not only remove all of the noise, but they remove
all the fidelity,
half of the fidelity and the musical content. And the other thing is then, once you have that cleaned in that balance where it sounds good, sounds great, and you haven't left in any crazy artifacts that people are going to say, oh my gosh, there's a skip or there's a pop, or then you go to the EQ phase. Which is really where you need a great mastering engineer who knows the tools.
And thankfully, we were able to spend even a lot of time before going into the studio on a lot of tracks. Not everything, but there were probably at least half the box.
Yeah, Martin was very helpful.
I was able to take some of the raw transfers and really spend time that otherwise we couldn't spend in the studio.
Right.
And work out EQ ahead of time, bring it in, see how it sounded. And a lot of times, most of the time, it was exactly, thank God, what I found, or it didn't take much more work that way.
Yeah. Sometimes we just needed to do a little bit of tweaking, but having that blueprint to start with, that starting point, was really helpful, and I owe a great
probably
deal
at least
Martin
half the
for
box,
doing that.
and the rest we did there.
Yeah, we did in the studio.
Now,
There's always that fine balance, but what we strove to do at every point was preserve the quality and tone of the original recording. So we didn't add very much in terms of compression. We didn't add very much in terms of EQ, crazy EQ, or we did EQ it, but we didn't add any reverb. I mean, we tried to use a little bit of reverb judiciously, and we decided that it was not giving us the sound that we wanted. So we just went back and said, we'll just leave them as they are,
Which was the best solution. It worked out. And the other thing was, you mentioned how things were coming up with the telephone line. And there were some tracks that say I had ahead of time to really spend a lot of time on.
Right.
And just try to remove some of that telephone line quality to the mid-range. Not to turn it into something it's not, but just take out enough where it's more pleasant sounding and more present and more high fidelity than it really is.
And, that was the idea. I know that you have a lot of audiophiles that follow you, Stephen, and you're a great audiophile and sound person yourself, and we really tried to do this with a lot of respect
for what's there,
for what was there. And in some cases I opted to include certain tracks that maybe, because they were historically important and were important in the context of the overall concept of the box set, I left them in, where if it were a 2 CD set I may not have. They might be of a little lesser quality. We may have had to leave a little more noise in. But I think on balance, I would say 80 to 85% of the set is really very fine sounding. And it certainly is the best sounding that any of this material has ever been presented.
And I should just add that what he mentioned, where we experimented with just seeing if reverb would be helpful, it was really just a few tracks on the Smithsonian disc where there were some tracks that were just not the most high fidelity.
They were a little dull.
And just trying to get an idea to see if we add like 2% of this, where you really don't hear the reverb, but you hear just a little bit more sheen to it, would it be useful? And it just didn't work.
We ended up coming up with a good process And at the end of the day, a really great sounding set of recordings that, bear in mind, are 70 to 80 years old.